The abandoned asylum had always been a place of dark whispers. For decades, it stood at the edge of town like a forgotten nightmare, its crumbling structure a silent witness to the horrors within. The local residents spoke in hushed tones about the place, each rumor darker than the last. But of all the mysteries surrounding the asylum, the one that always lingered in the background was the basement. No one knew exactly what was down there, but every story seemed to point to the same chilling fact. Whatever it was, no one wanted to find out. For years, the basement had been locked. The key was said to have been lost, or perhaps it was purposely hidden. The asylum had been built in the early 1900s with an air of superiority, a symbol of progressive care for the mentally ill. But as the years passed, it became apparent that its methods were anything but progressive. Behind the doors of the asylum, patients were subjected to horrifying treatments, often under the direction of doctors who seemed more interested in experimentation than healing. Lobotomies, electroshock therapy, and other untested procedures became standard practice. But through it all, one thing remained off-limits: the basement. It was almost as if the basement was a secret too dangerous to ever be shared. Staff came and went, but no one ever spoke of it. The patients, who were often too lost in their own mental battles to notice the whispers, were told to avoid the area. The few who did venture near it spoke of strange sounds, echoes of things moving in the dark, faint cries, and a deep sense of dread that seemed to permeate the very air around the basement door. No one dared to open it. It was said that the basement was the one part of the building that had never been part of the renovations, that it had been locked away for good reason. As time wore on, the asylum's reputation grew darker. Patients mysteriously disappeared, others died under unexplained circumstances, and the building itself seemed to take on a life of its own. People began to speculate that the basement might hold the key to these mysteries. But just as quickly they dismissed the thought, perhaps out of fear, perhaps because no one truly wanted to know what lay beneath. When the asylum was eventually abandoned in the 1970s, its once pristine walls crumbled under the weight of years of neglect. The building became a place of horror for local thrill-seekers and urban explorers, but the basement remained a forbidden area. No one dared to venture close. Even the most fearless of investigators steered clear, unwilling to confront what might be hidden in its depths. It wasn't until the early 2000s, when the building was finally slated for demolition, that the mystery of the basement resurfaced. The demolition company was tasked with clearing the land to make way for new development, but during one of the final inspection tours, an old key was discovered buried beneath the rotting floorboards of a nearby office. The key, covered in dust and rust, was not just any key, it was the key to the basement. At first, it seemed like a simple find, an artifact of the building's past. But as the workers examined the key more closely, something strange occurred. The discovery reignited the rumors. The once forgotten basement was now the focal point of a renewed fascination. What had been locked away for so long? Local historians, paranormal investigators, and curious thrill-seekers began to gather, all eager to unlock the mystery of what lay behind the basement door. Some thought it might be nothing more than an old storage space, filled with the forgotten possessions of long-dead patients and staff. Others believed that something far more sinister was hidden there, perhaps the remnants of the asylum's brutal past. The excitement was palpable, but there was one major problem. Time was running out. The demolition was scheduled to begin in just days. The basement door could be opened, but only for a fleeting moment. This was the last chance to uncover the secrets that had been locked away for so long. Despite the looming deadline, the building's demolition was postponed for a short while, giving the team of investigators and historians a brief window to explore. They were prepared to face whatever they might find, but no one could have anticipated the scale of what they would uncover. As the heavy iron door was pried open for the first time in decades, the group stepped into the unknown. At first it seemed like any other basement. The air was thick with dust, the smell of old wood and decay lingering in the corners. The floor was cracked and uneven, and the walls were coated with layers of grime. But as the investigators explored deeper, they began to notice things that set this basement apart from any other. Strange markings were etched into the walls, symbols that seemed to twist and contort unnaturally in the dim light. They looked like no language the investigators recognized, cryptic, bizarre, and unsettling. As they moved further into the depths of the basement, they began to find more evidence of the asylum's sinister history. Scattered across the floor were old medical records, pages torn from books and documents that had been hastily discarded. Some of the records appeared to be handwritten, detailing treatments and experiments performed on patients. The names were familiar, long-dead doctors and administrators who had long since disappeared from the public record. But the stories they told were horrifying, patients listed as subjects, experiments recorded as tests, and procedures described with cold, clinical precision. And then, as they ventured further still, they came across something that would change everything: a hidden door. It was tucked away in the farthest corner of the basement, nearly invisible behind a mass of old crates and broken furniture. But there it was, a small rusted door sealed shut with layers of grime and age. The group, now more determined than ever, pried open the door to reveal a small room. The room was empty, save for a few objects scattered across the floor. But what caught their attention was a journal. The journal was worn and yellowed with age, its leather cover cracked from years of neglect. It was clear that whoever had written in it had been desperate to record something, but the handwriting was erratic, disturbed even. The entries were fragmented, describing a growing sense of dread, of experiments that had gone horribly wrong. One entry was particularly chilling. It mentioned a patient, someone who had been subjected to horrific tests, their body altered beyond recognition. The entry ended abruptly with the final sentence reading, "The basement is the key." The room fell silent as the investigators exchanged uneasy glances. What did it all mean? What had been done in this place, and why had it been hidden for so long? The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together, but the truth was still elusive. They were only beginning to understand the full scale of the asylum's dark history. For years, the basement had been a forgotten corner of a forgotten building, a space locked away to protect its secrets. Now it was clear that the basement wasn't just a storage area, it was the heart of the asylum's horrors, the place where the most disturbing experiments had taken place, and where the darkest truths had been buried. But with the building's demolition looming, time was running out. Would they uncover everything before it was too late? The mystery of the asylum basement was far from over, and with every passing moment, the sense of dread only deepened. As the investigation continued, the pieces of the puzzle would fall into place, revealing truths that no one could have ever imagined. But for now, all that remained was the eerie silence of the basement, a silence that seemed to hold the secrets of a past that refused to stay buried. The asylum's history was as dark as the building itself. When it was first constructed in the early 1900s, it was heralded as a marvel of modern medicine. The goal was to provide a sanctuary for those suffering from mental illness, a place where they could receive care in a dignified, humane environment. It was supposed to be a progressive institution, a cutting-edge facility that embraced the latest psychiatric treatments and methodologies. But over the decades, as time wore on and the asylum's walls grew older, something far more sinister took root within its halls. In the beginning, everything seemed promising. The building was large and imposing, designed to provide a sense of order and control. It was constructed with an air of efficiency, its clean lines and symmetrical layout offering the appearance of rationality. The idea was to create a place of peace and healing, a retreat for the mind. But as the years passed, the asylum's lofty goals became increasingly overshadowed by its growing number of patients, the overcrowded conditions, and a medical staff that became more and more detached from the well-being of the people they were supposed to care for. The medical treatments employed at the asylum were, by today's standards, nothing short of barbaric. Doctors, many of whom had their own controversial methods and dubious qualifications, began to experiment with new forms of therapy. The asylum became a place where the lines between care and cruelty were constantly blurred. Patients were subjected to treatments that would be considered unethical by any modern standard, with little regard for their consent or well-being. Electroshock therapy was a common practice, often used as a catch-all treatment for a wide range of mental illnesses. Though the therapy was supposed to be used in controlled doses to alleviate certain symptoms, many patients were subjected to it without any understanding of its true effects. It was a blunt, invasive tool that became synonymous with suffering. But even more disturbing were the lobotomies. The asylum became infamous for performing this procedure on its patients, a method that was often used to cure patients who were deemed difficult or uncooperative. The lobotomy was a crude and irreversible surgery that involved severing the connections in the brain's prefrontal cortex. It was an attempt to suppress undesirable behaviors, essentially reducing the patient to a shell of their former selves. It was seen as a final solution for those who couldn't be fixed through other means. The doctors at the asylum were relentless in their pursuit of treatment, and as the years went by, the number of lobotomies performed at the facility grew. Patients were turned into hollow versions of themselves, their personalities erased and their lives altered forever. But what truly set the asylum apart was its secretive nature. Though there were whispers among the staff about strange, unethical practices, the real horrors remained hidden from the public eye. The basement, for example, was an area that few ever talked about. Even the staff, those who were present every day, seemed reluctant to acknowledge its existence. It was as though the basement itself was a symbol of the darker side of the asylum, an area where the most shameful and secretive actions were carried out. There were rumors of patients being locked away down there, subjected to inhumane experiments, or simply discarded when they no longer served a purpose. The secrecy surrounding the basement seemed almost deliberate. It was as though the asylum was trying to protect itself from the truth of what had occurred within its walls. The authorities had little interest in what happened inside the asylum. They were content to leave it be as long as the institution continued to operate. For years, there was no real oversight, no attempts to investigate what was really going on behind the closed doors of the asylum. The patients, many of whom had no families to speak of, were left to suffer in silence. Those who managed to leave the facility rarely spoke of their time there, either out of fear or out of shame. But the whispers never stopped. As time passed, more and more people began to question the legitimacy of the asylum's practices. Former staff members who had grown disillusioned with the facility began to speak out, telling stories of the cruel and unusual treatments that had been used on the patients. Some even spoke of experiments, medical procedures that were conducted in the basement, hidden from the public's view. Some claimed to have seen doctors conducting strange procedures. Others swore they had witnessed patients being kept locked away in the dark, their cries echoing through the halls. But no one could ever confirm these stories, and the asylum continued its operations with little interference. It wasn't until the 1970s, when the asylum was finally shut down and abandoned, that the full extent of its horrors began to emerge. The building, which had once stood proudly as a symbol of progress, was left to decay. As the asylum's doors were closed for the final time, the once bustling institution became little more than a hollow shell. The patients who had once called it home were scattered, many of them relocated to other facilities or simply left to fade into obscurity. The staff moved on, leaving behind their secrets and the dark memories of what had transpired within the asylum's walls. The building sat abandoned for years, slowly falling into disrepair. It became a place of urban legend, a haunting reminder of the past. The few who dared to venture inside spoke of strange sounds echoing through the halls, of the feeling of being watched, of an oppressive presence that seemed to hang over the place like a heavy cloud. But it was the basement that remained the focal point of the mystery. For some, it was a symbol of everything that had gone wrong at the asylum, an area that had been sealed off for a reason, a place where the worst of the institution's secrets were hidden. Rumors began to circulate that the basement might hold the key to understanding what had truly gone on at the asylum. The building, though abandoned, was still a site of fascination for thrill-seekers, paranormal investigators, and historians alike. Some believed the basement was haunted by the restless spirits of the patients who had been subjected to the asylum's cruel treatments. Others thought that the dark history of the place had left a lingering mark on the building itself, that it had become a repository for the negative energy and pain that had been experienced within its walls. But whatever the truth, the basement remained locked and inaccessible, a symbol of the institution's darkest secrets. As the years passed, the building's fate seemed sealed. It was left to deteriorate, its walls crumbling and its floors buckling under the weight of time. But the mystery of the basement remained unsolved. It was as if the building itself had become a monument to forgotten pain, its past buried beneath layers of dust and decay. The key to the basement was lost to time, and with it, any hope of uncovering the truth behind the asylum's dark history. But then, in the early 2000s, everything changed. The asylum was scheduled for demolition, a final chapter in the building's tragic story. The developers who were tasked with clearing the land for new construction were prepared to level the building, erasing it from existence. But during one of the final inspection tours, something unexpected happened. The old, rusted key to the basement was discovered. It had been buried beneath the floorboards of a long-forgotten office, a small, insignificant find to most people. But to the handful of curious individuals who knew the building's dark past, it was a revelation. The discovery of the key reignited interest in the asylum and its basement. Historians, urban explorers, and paranormal investigators all began to descend on the site, eager to uncover the secrets that had been hidden for so long. The building was scheduled for demolition, but now there was a chance, a fleeting chance, to finally unlock the basement and see what lay inside. The mystery that had haunted the town for so long was on the verge of being solved. But as excitement grew, so did the urgency. Time was running out, and with the demolition looming, the basement would soon be sealed off forever. The key had been found, but the answers to the asylum's dark history remained elusive. Would the truth finally be uncovered, or would it be lost forever, buried beneath the rubble of the demolished building? The countdown had begun, and the secrets of the basement were about to be revealed, whether anyone was ready for them or not. The discovery of the long-forgotten key ignited a wave of excitement and dread, as it provided the first real opportunity to uncover the truth behind the asylum's secrets. As word spread that the key had been found, a motley crew of historians, paranormal investigators, and urban explorers flocked to the site. Some came seeking to unravel the mysteries of the past, while others were drawn by the allure of the supernatural. For years, the basement had been a symbol of the unknown, a place where dark stories swirled but where no one had dared to venture. Now, with the key in hand, the door to that mystery was about to be opened. But there was a looming sense of unease among the group. It was as though the building itself had been waiting for this moment, the moment when it would reveal what had been hidden for so long. The demolition was scheduled to begin within days, which only added to the urgency. The once grand asylum, now a crumbling monument to the past, was about to be reduced to rubble. The key represented a fleeting chance to access something that had been locked away for decades. For some, it was an opportunity to uncover long-buried truths about the asylum's dark history, its cruel treatments, and the sinister figures who had overseen its operations. For others, it was the chance to explore the paranormal mysteries that had become part of the asylum's mythos. But no one, not even the most seasoned investigator, was prepared for what they were about to uncover. The first moments after the door to the basement was unlocked were tense. The air was thick with anticipation, and a sense of dread hung heavy in the atmosphere. The investigators hesitated, as though the basement itself was warning them to turn back. But curiosity, as it so often does, outweighed their fear. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a dark, narrow staircase that descended into the bowels of the building. It was as though they were stepping into another world, one that had been sealed off from the rest of the asylum for decades. The basement was untouched by time, its cold, musty air a stark contrast to the warmth of the upper floors. It was a world frozen in darkness, filled with secrets that had been locked away for too long. As the investigators descended into the basement, they could feel the weight of the building's history pressing down on them. The walls were lined with peeling paint and crumbling bricks, the floor was uneven and covered in dust. The dim light from their flashlights barely cut through the darkness, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move as they swept across the room. There was a sense of claustrophobia, as though the basement was too small, too narrow to contain everything it had seen. The air was thick with the smell of decay and mold, a physical reminder of the years of neglect that the building had endured. But it wasn't just the oppressive atmosphere that unsettled them, it was what they began to find. As they moved deeper into the basement, they discovered old medical equipment, rusted and forgotten. There were strange machines, tools that looked more like torture devices than instruments of healing. The walls were adorned with markings, symbols, scribbles, and what looked like a language they couldn't understand. Some of the symbols seemed to pulse with an energy that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand up. It was as though the basement itself was alive, holding on to the memories of everything that had transpired within its confines. The deeper they went, the more they began to uncover. Discarded medical records were scattered across the floor, their pages yellowed with age. The names on the documents were familiar, patients who had been subjected to the asylum's cruel treatments, their fates sealed in these forgotten pages. Some records were incomplete, leaving questions unanswered. Others were more disturbing, detailing experiments that bordered on the grotesque. It became clear that the basement was not just a storage space as some had believed. It was a laboratory, a place where the asylum's darkest secrets were carried out far from the prying eyes of the public. The first true shock came when they found a collection of photographs hidden in a locked box beneath a pile of debris. The photographs were disturbing to say the least. They showed patients in various stages of treatment, some with their faces distorted by pain, others with vacant expressions as though they had been completely broken by the procedures they had undergone. There were images of patients strapped to tables, their bodies exposed to harsh, unproven methods of therapy. The photographs seemed to capture the very essence of the asylum's brutality, a place where human beings were treated like experiments, their suffering documented for posterity. The images were a stark reminder of the cruelty that had been perpetrated in the name of treatment, a reminder that the asylum had been a place of unimaginable horror for so many. As they ventured further into the basement, they began to notice something even more disturbing, the presence of strange, unmarked doors. These doors led to small, hidden rooms, each one more unsettling than the last. Some of the rooms contained old, rusted cages, their bars bent and twisted, as though they had been used to hold something, or someone, against their will. Others contained piles of tattered clothing and broken furniture, remnants of a time long past. But there was one room that stood out among the rest. It was a small, windowless chamber tucked away at the far end of the basement. The door to this room was locked, but the investigators were able to force it open. Inside they found something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. A collection of journals. The journals were old and brittle, their pages yellowed and fragile. They had been hastily written, the handwriting erratic and disjointed, as though the author had been struggling to maintain control over their thoughts. The entries were fragmented, some making little sense at all, while others revealed a glimpse into the twisted mind of the person who had written them. The journals detailed the experiments that had taken place in the basement, the unholy methods that had been used to treat the patients. But the most disturbing part of the journals was the mention of a figure, a doctor who had overseen the experiments. This figure, whose name was never fully revealed, seemed to have been the mastermind behind the asylum's darkest deeds. The journals spoke of secret procedures, of patients who had disappeared without a trace, and of a growing sense of madness that had overtaken the asylum in its final years. The journals also mentioned something even more chilling. A hidden room within the basement, a place that no one had ever been able to find. This room, according to the journals, was where the most horrifying experiments had taken place. The room was said to be sealed off, its entrance hidden behind a false wall. The journal entries were vague, but they hinted at a series of medical procedures so grotesque that they defied comprehension. The figure who had written the journal seemed to be on the verge of a breakthrough, some kind of twisted revelation that had consumed him. The last entry, written in a trembling hand, simply read, "The basement is the key, but I cannot continue. It's too late now. The truth will remain hidden." As the investigators read the journals, they were struck by a sense of overwhelming dread. The basement had never been just a storage space or a place for discarded equipment. It had been the heart of the asylum's twisted operations. The deeper they delved into the basement, the more they realized that the asylum's secrets were far darker than anyone could have imagined. And with the demolition looming, the clock was ticking. The chance to uncover the full extent of the asylum's horrors was slipping away. The room grew colder as they continued to investigate. The temperature seemed to drop with each passing moment, and the air grew thick with the sense that something was watching them. It was as if the building itself had come alive, its history and its secrets pressing in on them from all sides. They had come seeking the truth, but what they found in that basement was something far worse, a darkness that had been sealed away for decades, and a mystery that seemed impossible to unravel. The investigators knew that they were on the verge of something monumental. The pieces were falling into place, but they couldn't shake the feeling that there was more, so much more, yet to be uncovered. The basement held the key to the asylum's dark history, but unlocking its secrets would come at a cost. Whatever had been done in that basement, whatever had been hidden there for so long, had left an indelible mark on the building, and on the people who dared to uncover the truth. The question now was whether they were ready to face what lay beneath, or whether the truth was something that could never be fully revealed. As the investigators began to process what they had uncovered in the asylum's basement, the atmosphere grew tense. The room was charged with an eerie energy, as though the walls themselves were watching them, holding their breath, waiting for the next chapter of the mystery to unfold. The journals they had found in that hidden room, with their erratic, fragmented entries, continued to haunt their thoughts. The mention of a hidden room within the basement lingered like a ghost in their minds, an unanswered question that was begging to be solved. It was clear that there was more to the asylum than any of them had anticipated. The asylum, once seen as a place of healing and care, had revealed itself to be a labyrinth of darkness and despair. The journals hinted at a vast conspiracy, one that stretched beyond the asylum's walls and into the very fabric of the town itself. There were mentions of powerful figures, shadowy individuals who had helped fund and protect the institution's nefarious activities. These people, it seemed, had played a part in covering up the truth, perhaps to protect their own interests or to safeguard a dark secret that had been festering for decades. But as the investigators began to piece together the puzzle, they realized that the story was even more complicated than they had imagined. The asylum's past was not just about cruelty and inhumanity, it was about control, manipulation, and a sinister desire to push the boundaries of what was possible. As the investigation progressed, the team became more and more obsessed with finding the hidden room described in the journals. They scoured every inch of the basement, turning over debris, searching for any clues that might lead them to the elusive door. But the room remained elusive, as though it existed in a space beyond their reach, just out of sight. With each passing hour, their sense of urgency grew. They knew that they were running out of time, that the building's demolition was looming ever closer. If they didn't find the room soon, it would be lost forever, along with the final pieces of the asylum's dark history. It was during one of these late-night searches that something strange happened. The group had been scouring the far corner of the basement, near the wall where they had found the journals, when they noticed a slight irregularity in the wall itself. At first it was subtle, just a faint seam in the stone, a line that didn't quite match up with the rest of the wall structure. But as they pressed their hands against it, they could feel the faintest give, as though the wall was hiding something beneath its surface. A sense of excitement and dread washed over them. Could this be it? Could this be the hidden room they had been searching for? With trembling hands they pulled at the stone, careful not to disturb anything that might give away their discovery. The wall groaned, its centuries-old materials creaking in protest, but eventually with one final push, a hidden door slowly revealed itself. It was nothing like the rest of the asylum. This door was crude, hastily constructed, as though someone had gone to great lengths to hide it. It was a small, unremarkable thing, hardly larger than a cupboard door, yet its discovery felt like a momentous occasion. They were on the cusp of uncovering the last remaining secret of the asylum, a secret that had been buried for decades, perhaps longer. The door swung open with an unsettling creak, revealing a small, cramped room. Unlike the rest of the basement, which was dark and decaying, this room was eerily well preserved. The air was thick with the smell of old wood and mildew, but there was something else, something that the investigators couldn't quite place. It felt colder here, the temperature dropping as if the room itself had a different climate than the rest of the building. The investigators hesitated before stepping inside, their flashlights flicking nervously around the room. They were about to enter a space that had been untouched for so long, a place that had been hidden for reasons they could not yet understand. What had been done here? What had happened in this room that was so important, so dangerous, that it needed to be sealed away from the world? The room was small, just enough space for a single bed, a worn desk and a single chair. But it was what was on the walls that immediately drew their attention. Scrawled across the peeling wallpaper were strange symbols, similar to the ones they had found earlier in the basement. These symbols were more elaborate, more detailed, almost as if they were a language of their own. They were arranged in patterns, some of which seemed to follow a sequence, as though they had a specific meaning. It was clear that whoever had been here had spent a great deal of time carefully inscribing these markings, and their presence in this hidden room only deepened the mystery. But the most shocking discovery came when they examined the desk. On top of it lay a collection of old papers, some of which were too fragile to touch. However, one paper stood out, a photograph. It was old, faded with age and crumpled at the edges. The investigators gently unrolled it, revealing an image that would haunt them forever. The photograph depicted a group of people, their faces obscured by shadows, standing in front of a large, ominous structure. But it wasn't the building that caught their attention. It was the figure in the center of the photograph. This figure, clad in dark clothing, had an air of authority about them. Their eyes seemed to burn with a strange intensity, as though they were staring directly at the viewer, willing them to uncover the truth. The figure's identity remained a mystery, but their presence in the photograph was unsettling. It was clear that they were someone important, someone who had played a significant role in the asylum's dark history. The photograph was accompanied by a series of handwritten notes, the handwriting matching the erratic scrawl found in the journals. The notes were fragmented, incomplete, but they spoke of the experiments that had taken place in the hidden room. They spoke of a series of procedures that had been conducted on patients, procedures that were not just unethical but outright monstrous. The notes described surgeries that went beyond anything the investigators had ever heard of, procedures that altered the very essence of the human mind. The descriptions were vague, but the implication was clear. Something had gone horribly wrong in this room. The patients who had been subjected to these experiments had never been the same, their minds and bodies irrevocably changed. But as they continued to sift through the papers, they began to uncover something even more chilling. Mentions of a secret project, one that had been funded by powerful figures outside the asylum. The project, it seemed, was part of a larger scheme to test the limits of human endurance, to see how far they could push the human mind before it broke. The figures involved in this project were never fully named, but the notes spoke of wealthy benefactors, government officials, and high-ranking medical professionals who had been involved in the asylum's work. The more the investigators read, the clearer it became that the asylum had not just been a place of care, it had been a front for something much darker, something that stretched far beyond its walls. As the investigators stood in the hidden room, the weight of their discoveries began to sink in. They had uncovered a secret that had been buried for years, hidden from the world for a reason. The asylum was not just a place of suffering, It had been a site for twisted experimentation, for the manipulation of the human mind and body. And the person at the center of it all, the mysterious figure in the photograph, was someone who had orchestrated it all. The investigation had led them to the heart of the asylum's darkness, but even now, they could feel that there were still more secrets lurking in the shadows. The door to the hidden room creaked as it swung shut behind them. The investigators had uncovered more than they could have ever imagined, but in doing so, they had opened a door to a past that would forever haunt them. The final chapter of the asylum's dark history was about to be written, but whether they were prepared to face it was another matter entirely. As they left the room, the sense of urgency intensified. Time was running out, and with each passing moment, they were one step closer to the truth, or to losing it forever. The basement had given up its secrets, but the asylum's legacy was far from finished. The clock was ticking, and the investigators were on the edge of uncovering a truth that could shake the very foundations of everything they thought they knew. As the investigators left the hidden room and made their way back to the dimly lit basement, a heavy silence fell over them. They had just uncovered a fragment of the asylum's deepest secrets, but there was a haunting sense that the most important revelations were still waiting to be uncovered. The journal entries, the photographs, the mysterious figure, everything pointed to a larger, more terrifying truth, but there were still pieces of the puzzle left unsolved. The investigators had uncovered the horrific nature of the experiments, but the scope of the asylum's actions was much greater than any of them had imagined. Who were the people involved in this project? Why was this dark chapter in history so carefully concealed? And what had become of the patients who had been subjected to the twisted procedures in the hidden room? The answers, it seemed, were buried deep within the walls of the asylum, and the clock was ticking. The building was scheduled for demolition, and with each passing moment, the opportunity to uncover the final pieces of the puzzle grew smaller. They had already come so far, had unlocked secrets that no one had dared to investigate for decades, but they couldn't shake the feeling that they were just scratching the surface. The deeper they delved into the asylum's history, the more questions arose, and the more chilling the answers became. As they stood there in the basement, their minds racing with the implications of what they had found, one of the investigators, a seasoned historian named Elizabeth, spoke up. "We need to go back to the beginning. There's something we're missing. A part of the story that doesn't fit." Her voice was steady, but there was an edge of uncertainty in it. The others turned to her, their eyes reflecting the same confusion and concern. They had all been so focused on the hidden room and the experiments that they hadn't stopped to think about the larger picture. Elizabeth continued, "What if this wasn't just an isolated event? What if the asylum was only part of a much larger network? A network of institutions all connected to this same project?" The idea hung in the air, unsettling and impossible to ignore. The asylum was notorious, no doubt, but what if there were more institutions like it? More places where experiments were being conducted under the guise of medical care? The asylum's secrecy, the hidden rooms, the elaborate efforts to bury the truth, none of it made sense unless there was a larger purpose behind it. Elizabeth's words triggered a new sense of urgency within the group. They couldn't just focus on this one building. They had to understand the bigger picture, the people behind the project, and the extent of their reach. The next few hours were spent combing through old records, medical documents, and anything else they could find that might connect the asylum to other locations, other experiments, and other victims. The journals they had found earlier mentioned a few other institutions, strangely named facilities scattered across the country. These institutions were described as sister facilities to the asylum, places where similar experiments were taking place. But these references were sparse, almost cryptic, and the investigators had no way of knowing if the other facilities were still in operation, or if they had been shut down years ago, just like the asylum. Then, in the corner of the room, one of the investigators, a young journalist named James, came across a box of old files. The box was buried beneath a pile of discarded medical equipment, but something about it caught his attention. As he sifted through the files, he found something that sent a chill down his spine. A list of names, all tied to specific experiments conducted in the hidden rooms. There were patients listed, many of whom were identified only by numbers, but there were also a few names of people who had signed off on these experiments: doctors, administrators, even government officials. The list was a who's who of the asylum's dark history, and among those names was one that stood out above the rest: Dr. Charles Hawthorne. Dr. Hawthorne had been the chief physician at the asylum for nearly 2 decades, and his name appeared repeatedly throughout the records. He had overseen the majority of the experiments described in the journals and had been a key figure in the asylum's brutal medical practices. What was even more disturbing, however, was the fact that Dr. Hawthorne's name had also appeared in connection with the other facilities mentioned in the journals. It seemed that he had been the mastermind behind the entire network of asylums, facilities that were operating under the radar, hidden from public scrutiny. The discovery was a bombshell. The asylum was not an isolated case. It was part of a larger, far-reaching operation. And at the heart of it all was Dr. Hawthorne. But who was he? What drove him to orchestrate such horrific experiments? What did he hope to achieve, and how many other institutions had been involved in this dark project? As the investigators pored over the files, they began to uncover more pieces of the puzzle. The experiments conducted at the asylum were not just medical in nature, they were psychological, too. There were references to a mind control program, an attempt to alter and manipulate the human psyche in ways that had never been attempted before. The patients who were subjected to these experiments were not just victims of physical trauma, they were victims of a twisted, calculated effort to break their minds and reprogram them into something else. The true horror of the asylum's legacy was beginning to take shape, and it was worse than they had ever imagined. The team worked tirelessly, piecing together every shred of evidence they could find, but the closer they got to the truth, the more they realized how deep this conspiracy ran. The project that Dr. Hawthorne had started was far more extensive than they could have imagined, stretching across state lines and involving individuals who had managed to keep their involvement hidden for decades. The power behind the project was immense, and it had remained untouchable for so long. But now, with the asylum's final days drawing near, it seemed that the truth was finally on the verge of being exposed. The investigators were no longer just uncovering the history of a single asylum, they were uncovering a sprawling, decades-long operation that had affected countless lives. As they continued to delve into the records, they found evidence of patients who had disappeared, their names erased from history. There were records of government cover-ups, officials who had been paid to remain silent, and even hints of people being silenced permanently, their deaths covered up as accidents or suicides. The more they uncovered, the more they realized how much had been hidden, how many lives had been ruined, and how many families had been left in the dark. The asylum had been a facade, a front for something much darker, much more insidious. The people behind it had operated in the shadows, unchallenged and unseen for far too long. But now, with the demolition of the asylum imminent, they had only days to uncover the final pieces of the puzzle. As they worked, the investigators couldn't help but wonder how many other places like this existed. Hidden institutions, operating in the shadows, conducting experiments that no one could ever imagine. How many more Dr. Hawthornes were out there, quietly carrying on their twisted work, protected by the same system that had allowed the asylum to thrive for so long? The thought was enough to send a wave of unease through the group. They were on the verge of uncovering something monumental, something that could change everything, but they knew that the cost of doing so would be high. And then, as the final hours before the demolition ticked away, something unexpected happened. The investigators received an anonymous tip, a phone call that seemed to come from nowhere. The voice on the other end was distorted, unrecognizable, but the message was clear. Stop digging. You don't know what you're messing with. You have no idea what you're about to unleash. The warning sent chills down their spines. The person on the other end seemed to know exactly what they had uncovered, and they were warning them to stop. But it was too late. They had come too far. The truth was too close to ignore, and they were determined to see it through to the end. But as the final hours of the asylum's existence dwindled, the question remained. Would they be able to uncover the full extent of the asylum's horrors before it was destroyed? Or would the building, with its dark legacy, be erased from history forever, its secrets buried beneath the rubble? The countdown had begun, and the final chapter of this haunting story was about to be written. The hours were dwindling, the heavy weight of the unknown pressing on their minds as the investigators braced themselves for what lay ahead. They had spent countless hours digging through records, piecing together fragments of the asylum's dark past, but now, as the demolition date loomed ever closer, they had an overwhelming sense of urgency. The clock was ticking, each moment slipping through their fingers like sand. The anonymous warning had only added to the tension, a chilling reminder that the stakes were higher than they had ever imagined. Whoever had issued that warning knew something that the investigators were not yet privy to. It felt as though they were walking a razor's edge, and one misstep could unravel everything they had worked so hard to uncover. As the investigators sat around the makeshift table, papers and photographs scattered in front of them, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were closing in on something much larger than they had ever anticipated. The truth about the asylum, about Dr. Hawthorne, about the network of experiments, was just within reach, but the deeper they dug, the more sinister and complex the web became. The disturbing photographs, the cryptic journals, the hidden room, they had all pointed to the same conclusion. The asylum wasn't just a failed institution. It was a testing ground for something far darker, a twisted experiment on the human psyche and body that had spanned decades and reached far beyond the asylum's walls. But what had been the ultimate goal? What had they been trying to accomplish? In a last-ditch effort to find answers, the team decided to focus on Dr. Charles Hawthorne, the enigmatic figure at the center of the storm. They had already learned that he had been involved with several other facilities, but they needed to understand more about him, his motivations, and his methods. Hawthorne had been the chief architect of the asylum's operations, and the more they learned about him, the more it became clear that he was no ordinary doctor. His rise to prominence had been swift and unsettling, marked by a series of questionable decisions and a disturbing lack of empathy for the patients he had sworn to help. As the investigators delved deeper into Hawthorne's personal life, they began to uncover troubling patterns. There were records of him attending secretive conferences, ones that were never fully documented, where he had met with other influential figures in the world of psychiatry, medicine, and government. These meetings were shrouded in secrecy, with no clear records of what had been discussed, but it was apparent that Hawthorne had been part of a larger network of individuals pushing the boundaries of science in ways that could not be justified by any ethical standard. It was clear that his experiments at the asylum were not isolated incidents. They were part of a grander scheme, one that had been orchestrated with a singular, chilling purpose. Further digging into Hawthorne's background revealed that he had come from a family with deep ties to the political elite. His father, a prominent figure in local government, had used his influence to secure his son a position at the asylum, despite Hawthorne's lack of traditional qualifications. There were whispers of connections to shadowy organizations, powerful people who had quietly funded Hawthorne's research and provided him with the resources he needed to continue his experiments. It was clear now that the asylum had never been a place for healing. It had been a front, a place where the rich and powerful could carry out their darkest ambitions under the guise of medical care. Hawthorne, it seemed, had been a puppet master, controlling the lives of his patients while hiding behind a mask of scientific credibility. The more the investigators uncovered about Hawthorne's background, the more they began to see a pattern of manipulation and control. He had been obsessed with the idea of mastering the human mind, of bending it to his will, and his methods had become more extreme as time went on. The patients in the asylum had not been treated with compassion. They had been used as test subjects in a dangerous experiment that sought to push the boundaries of mental and physical endurance. The mind control experiments, the lobotomies, the electroshock treatments, everything had been part of Hawthorne's twisted vision of what human beings could become when stripped of their humanity. But as the investigators began to piece together the full scope of Hawthorne's ambitions, they realized that there was something even more chilling at play. It wasn't just about manipulating minds, it was about erasing the very concept of identity. The ultimate goal, it seemed, was to create a new kind of human being, one that could be controlled, molded, and shaped into whatever the powers that be desired. The patients who had passed through the asylum's doors had been subjected to horrific, dehumanizing treatments, all in the name of a higher cause. But that cause, it seemed, was rooted in a chilling ideology, the belief that the human mind could and should be bent to the will of those in power. The team was left with a terrifying realization. They had been uncovering the tragic stories of the asylum's victims, the men and women who had suffered unimaginable horrors at the hands of Dr. Hawthorne and his colleagues. But there was more to the story. The patients had not been the only ones affected by the asylum's dark operations. The people who had been involved in these experiments, the doctors, the administrators, the politicians, had all played a part in creating this monstrous system. They had turned a blind eye to the suffering, enabling the asylum's twisted agenda to continue unchecked for decades. But the investigators were not just uncovering the past, they were uncovering a legacy of corruption and cruelty that had shaped the future in ways they could not yet understand. In the final hours before the demolition, the team gathered one last time to review everything they had learned. They had discovered the full extent of Dr. Hawthorne's vision, and they had pieced together the dark network of institutions that had supported his work. They had uncovered the horrifying truth about the experiments, about the patients who had been exploited and discarded, and about the powerful people who had helped make it all possible. But there was still one thing that haunted them, the mysterious figure in the photograph, the one who had been standing at the center of it all. Who was this person, and how were they connected to the larger conspiracy? The figure had seemed important, perhaps even more so than Dr. Hawthorne, and the investigators couldn't shake the feeling that they had missed something crucial. With time running out, the investigators decided to make one final attempt to uncover the figure's identity. They retraced their steps, going through every photograph, every journal, and every file they had found in the basement. After hours of searching, they finally discovered something that had been overlooked before, a small detail hidden in the background of the photograph. In the corner of the image, barely visible, was a logo, an insignia that was attached to the mysterious figure's clothing. It was a symbol that had appeared in several of the asylum's records, a symbol that had been linked to a powerful organization, one that had been funding the experiments from behind the scenes. The logo, it turned out, belonged to a private research group, a shadowy organization that had been operating in secret for decades. This group, known only as the Consortium, had been involved in the funding and oversight of Dr. Hawthorne's experiments. They were the ones who had provided the financial backing for his work, enabling him to conduct his twisted experiments without interference. But the Consortium was more than just a group of wealthy individuals. It was a network of elites, politicians, and business leaders, all working together to advance their own agendas. The mysterious figure in the photograph, it seemed, was a high-ranking member of this group, someone who had played a central role in overseeing the asylum's operations and ensuring that its dark secrets remained buried. As the final hours before the demolition ticked away, the investigators realized that they had uncovered the tip of an iceberg, a vast conspiracy that reached far beyond the asylum. Dr. Hawthorne and his colleagues had been pawns in a much larger game, one that had been played out over decades by the most powerful people in the world. The asylum was just one part of a global network of secret experiments, all designed to manipulate and control the human mind. The truth had been hidden for so long, buried beneath layers of deception and corruption, but now, with the demolition of the asylum imminent, the investigators had uncovered a glimpse of the darkness that had shaped the world around them. But the question remained, would the full extent of the conspiracy ever be revealed? Would anyone ever be held accountable for the horrors that had taken place? Or would the asylum, its secrets, and its legacy be erased forever, buried beneath the rubble of a forgotten building? The truth was out there, waiting to be uncovered, but whether the world was ready to face it was another matter entirely. The night was closing in as the final hours of the asylum's existence ticked away. Outside, the demolition crews were preparing, their machines lined up like ominous shadows against the backdrop of the decaying building. Inside, the investigators were still feverishly working, piecing together every last shred of evidence they could find. Their faces were pale, exhausted from the relentless search, but there was an unspoken drive among them, a determination to uncover the truth, no matter what it took. The truth was not just for the victims of the asylum, but for everyone who had been unknowingly touched by its legacy. They had seen the horrors that had occurred within these walls, but there was still so much left to learn. The investigation had become personal. They had to finish what they had started. The discovery of the Consortium had been a revelation, one that had shaken them to their core. The more they learned about this shadowy organization, the more it became clear that the asylum was just one piece of a much larger, far-reaching conspiracy. The Consortium wasn't just funding experiments on the human mind, they were controlling them. Dr. Hawthorne, while undoubtedly a key figure in the asylum's operations, was merely a pawn in a larger game. The real power lay with the Consortium, a network of elites who had used their wealth and influence to carry out their own dark agenda. They had manipulated everything, from the research to the funding, to the very lives of the patients who had been subjected to cruel and inhumane treatments. But who were these powerful figures and what had they hoped to achieve? What was the endgame? The investigators had only scratched the surface. They needed more answers and they needed them fast. Time was running out, and with each passing second, the asylum was being erased from existence. Its crumbling walls, the remnants of a dark history, were about to be obliterated in a matter of hours. The hidden rooms, the secret passages, the disturbing symbols. The asylum had become a time capsule, preserving the horrors of the past, but soon it would be gone. The investigators knew they had to act fast. The final pieces of the puzzle were within reach, but they had to find them before it was too late. It was then that a breakthrough came, one that would change everything. One of the investigators, Sarah, a sharp-eyed researcher, was going through old newspaper clippings and government records when she stumbled upon a series of articles detailing a high-profile case from the 1950s. The case had been widely covered at the time, but had since been forgotten by most. It was a scandal involving a group of prominent politicians, business leaders, and scientists who had been accused of orchestrating illegal experiments on mental patients in several institutions across the country. The article was vague in many respects, but what caught Sarah's attention was a name that kept appearing in connection with the case: Robert Langford. Langford's name had come up several times before in their investigation, but this was the first time they had seen it tied to a larger scandal. The articles hinted that Langford was not only connected to the consortium but had been one of its founding members. The details were murky, but the implication was clear. Langford had been a central figure in the creation of the network of institutions that had been conducting illegal and unethical experiments. The more Sarah dug into Langford's background, the more she realized that he wasn't just a businessman or politician. He was a powerful figure who had been involved in shaping the policies that allowed these experiments to thrive. He had used his influence to push through legislation that effectively legalized the use of mental patients as guinea pigs for experimental procedures, and in return he had been paid handsomely by the consortium. Langford's role in the asylum's dark history became more apparent as the investigators pieced together the timeline of events. He had been a frequent visitor to the asylum, attending meetings with Dr. Hawthorne and other key figures involved in the experiments. Langford's business dealings were also deeply entwined with the asylum's funding, and it seemed that he had played a critical role in ensuring that the asylum's operations were not only funded but protected from scrutiny. There were even whispers that Langford had been involved in covering up the deaths of patients who had died as a result of the experiments. He had used his power to silence anyone who dared to speak out about the atrocities taking place within the asylum's walls. But there was something else about Langford that stood out, a strange connection to the mysterious figure in the photograph. The more the investigators learned about him, the more it seemed that Langford had been involved in a vast network of power players who had all been working toward the same goal, to create a new kind of society, one where control and manipulation of the human mind were the ultimate tools of power. The patients at the asylum were nothing more than pawns in a much larger game, and Langford had been at the center of it all. As the investigators connected the dots, they realized that Langford's involvement in the asylum was just the beginning. His network of influence extended far beyond the walls of the institution. There were ties to government officials, to corporations, and even to the media. Langford had used his vast network to cover up the asylum's darkest secrets, to ensure that no one ever questioned the institution's practices. And with the help of the consortium, he had managed to keep everything hidden, buried beneath layers of bureaucracy and corruption. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became that the asylum had been nothing more than a cog in a much larger machine. The consortium had created a system that allowed them to control the lives of countless individuals, people who had no idea they were being experimented on, people whose suffering had been erased from history. And as the investigators unraveled this conspiracy, they couldn't help but wonder, how many other places like this existed? How many other institutions had been allowed to operate in the shadows, conducting experiments that no one had ever known about? How deep did the rabbit hole go? The demolition was only hours away, and yet, as the investigators compiled their findings, they felt a strange sense of helplessness. They had uncovered the identities of the key players, they had pieced together the twisted history of the asylum, and they had learned that the conspiracy stretched far beyond anything they had ever imagined. But what could they do with this information? The asylum was about to be reduced to rubble, its secrets buried beneath the debris. Who would listen to their findings? Who would believe them? Would anyone care? Sarah's voice broke the silence, cutting through the heavy air. "We can't let it end like this," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "We have to get this out there. We have to make sure that people know the truth." The others nodded, their faces grim but resolute. They had come this far and they couldn't back down now. The truth needed to be known, not just for the sake of the victims who had suffered in silence, but for the future. The world needed to understand the lengths to which the powerful had gone to manipulate and control the lives of those who were most vulnerable. The asylum was just the beginning. The consortium's influence reached far beyond the walls of this one building, and it was time to shine a light on their shadowy network. As they made their way to the exit, the investigators felt the weight of their decision bearing down on them. They had uncovered something monumental, something that could change everything, but the risks were immense. They were about to take on one of the most powerful networks in the world, and they knew that the consequences could be dire. But there was no turning back. The truth was out there, and they were going to make sure it saw the light of day.